we go. Welcome to Mythology. Our myth for today is Narcissus. And I am delighted yet again to have Anastasios, Dr. Anastasios Gaitanidis, talking about the myth of Narcissus. We've done now a series of myths, and this one perhaps is such a powerful one in our time. We did Medea not too long ago, which again was unbelievably powerful. And I've had people calling me and saying, thank you for just having that myth being told to us, because it encapsulates, doesn't it? A myth encapsulates psychology in such a small way. But of course, here we have Dr. Anastasios Gaitanidis, who also knows so much about mythology. He is Greek, but we won't hold that against you for the moment. And he's struggling between going to Greece and coming back to London, but we're delighted you're here. And also you're going to tell the myth itself. So we will then talk about it, what it means, not only in its interpretation, but what it means to us psychologically, but also in our society and in our future, where people are not having as many children, and how do people relate to each other, especially in the world of social media and so on. So it's such a big subject. So thank you for suggesting Narcissus. And it's such a poignant, sad and moving story. So over to you, Anastasios.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you. I think, you're right. Psychology, especially psychoanalysis, couldn't exist without the existence of myths. I mean, myths occupy a central place in psychoanalysis, both in Freudian, in Jungian, in other sort of. There is always the myth becomes it has a central place. And you're right. I think we have agreed, and we've done a series of myths now that are really very important. And the Narcissus myth is as important, perhaps, as all the others. It's quite poignant because it's very relevant for our times. And a lot of people have characterized the times that we live as quite narcissistic. But we'll come back to that later on. So I want to mention the myth itself. Narcissus was a very beautiful young man, born out of the god Sisyphus and Celephus and the nymph Lyriope. I'm pronouncing in a Greek manner the names, but I hope it's okay. So Narcissus was a beautiful young man, and as it happens in all the Greek myths, the important blind seer appears at some point and delivers a prophecy or an oracle. And that is the blind seer is Tiresias, the one who also participated in the Oedipus myth and revealed the truth of the sin that the hubris that Oedipus had committed. So for Narcissus, he said that he will live to a ripe old age if he doesn't get to know himself. And this is interpreted in different ways, but let's leave the interpretation to the side, but in order to describe the myth. So Narcissus goes through his life, but his beauty is so extraordinary that somehow people around him fall in love with him and just want to possess this beautiful young man and to have a relationship with him. But he goes from one lover to the other without responding, without having any desire to form any connection. And then he finds himself accidentally, in a pool of water, and he sees his own image and reflected on the surface of the water surface. And he falls in love with his own image, his own sort of, that as Tiresias says, he will live to a ripe old age if he doesn't get to know himself. That is to see his own image. So he sees his own image, falls in love with his image. He falls so much in love that he wants to embrace his image and be one with it. And by being one with it, he drowns himself in the pool of water. And of course, this myth is characteristic of someone who becomes quite self-absorbed with one's own image and drowns in his own sort of self-love. instead of actually noticing his surroundings and paying attention to all the love he receives from others. Of course, one of these others is the famous myth, the famous Echo, who is a nymph of the forest who falls in love with Narcissus and follows him around and tries to attract his attention, but fundamentally, she doesn't receive any love from Narcissus. There is no any reciprocation, and she eventually retreats into a cave and she pines away. And what remains of her is simply the repetition of the echo of Narcissus' voice. There are different variations of the myth. This is one of the most common ones. In one of the variations, what Echo does, even after she pines away and her body sort of disappears and only her voice remains as a reflection of the voice of Narcissus, which again, this is another reflection. We have the visual reflection, the reflection of the image. And this is the reflection now. Echo is the reflection of the voice, right? It's the oral reflection, whereas the visual one. So the reflection, she finds a way to repeat certain syllables from, in order to convey the message she wanted to Narcissus that she loves him. In a way, repeating, echoing back to Narcissus, certain parts of the words that he speaks, so as to tell him, to convey the message that she loves him. And that is, in her clever wisdom, she finds a way to communicate her love through this type of repetition. That's one of the versions of the myth. In others, simply, pines away and she becomes simply a reflection. But this is the myth in a kind of summary, very, very, very brief.
Okay, although you've said it briefly, you have Tiresias, who equally isn't Tiresias in Shakespeare's work as well. He's very much prominent in Shakespeare's work. He's now lost because in our modern day concept, we've lost the mythology and the power of mythology. But this couldn't be more powerful than today. So let's break it down. Because you said it simply, but you've effectively said, this is a man who's been told, if you get to know yourself, you will die. And that's sort of foretold to him. This is, your fortune. And then he finds himself in the water, sees himself and falls in love with himself. So he falls back into that oceanic, I love myself, that early stage of, when the mother has the child, the whole joy of a mother having a child is meant to be that oceanic feeling, you are loved. The big blue eyes the baby has, or whatever color eyes or brown eyes that represent the mother in the baby's image.
Yes.
And that oceanic, also omnipotent moment, he goes back to that, but drowns in it. And when we do our work as therapists, you have to go back to those early stages, don't you?
Yeah. I think on some level there are different interpretations of this return. Either they see it in a kind of returning back to this very early symbiotic oceanic feeling in one version of the psychoanalytic sort of story. In another, there is simply a kind of removal from any contact with any objects, any objects, any persons of that you form attachments with. So there is a kind of withdrawal from any communication. In the myth, it's very characteristic that Narcissus goes from one person to another without investing, without having any connection with any of them, and gradually withdrawing, and to the extent that then he falls in love with his own image, this type of self-love that eventually absorbs him into himself and makes him not pay attention to the surroundings and anyone else, and eventually drowning, which of course is one of the things that is quite telling about Freud's introduction to narcissism, when he said that loving oneself is fundamental prerequisite for starting in life in a kind of robust way. But if you fail to love another, then eventually you will not be able to survive, psychologically at least. So there is something about a necessary movement away from one's for self-love to the love of the other, and as a kind of as a way of an excess, that excess of energy that that can actually cannot be satisfied anymore out of one sort of self-sufficiency, and we need the other to depend on the other in order to be able to survive. So in that sense, it becomes very important. However, there are different interpretations and different sort of controversies about how we start our lives. Do we start our lives as monads, as absorbed in our own selves, and gradually we find the other, or the other is there at the beginning, and our and our relationship with them gets differentiated to the extent that the boundaries between self and other become more clear. So this is the fundamental sort of controversy. Is there a kind of self-sufficiency right from the beginning that needs to be broken in order to meet the other, or is there a kind of the other there from the beginning, and gradually you become? Narcissism is a way of withdrawing from the other, or is it a way of differentiating the boundaries and making, maintaining a sense of self, but in relation to another purpose,
But doesn't it depend on the person? And this is where it's so powerful, the work we do, because it's so individual. And that's what I try to make sure that everybody knows. None of us are the same. And each child has different needs.
And
can you respond as a parent to that child's needs at that moment in time effectively, that satisfies the child? And perhaps the child is never meant to be satisfied. Maybe baby is never meant to be satisfied, or they will never progress, never search, never find their own way. But having said that, it doesn't give carte blanche to treat a child badly. But what it does mean, that if you can do as much as you can do, it means then that the child has to find their own way in the world that suits them, their temperament, that may be out of sync with their parents, their primary caregiver. And I think the difficulty, I think, with psychoanalysis and any theory, and my goodness, psychoanalysis, there's so many books written, so many people wanting to help. Let's be clear. In the psychoanalytic field or psychodynamic field, everybody wants to help. It comes from the position of, let me see if I can understand. Let me see if I can bring something to this understanding of the psyche of that person that comes into the world, so that they are in some way supported, that they can be supported for growth and to understand. But it's also has to be read by the adult. In order to support the child. But the intention of everybody who writes is to help and support. And so their view is one to support, but everybody has a different view, all aiming to a one-size-fits-all, but it doesn't.
It doesn't, no, it doesn't. And I think there are different ways of seeing that. On some level, one might say that the narcissism of the child exists only because of the narcissism of the parents. So, there is a lot of emphasis on at least at the beginning, on the child being a kind of extension of the parents' narcissism and satisfying in a way the narcissistic desires of the children. I often thought that the desire to have a child is not about the child, because the child doesn't exist yet. If it's our own desire.
My goodness, that is such a big statement. Isn't it?
I mean, in many ways,
it is.
the child is not yet present, right? No. It's just an idea in one's head. I want to be a parent. Right?
Yeah, but it's not just I want to be a parent. It's more I want to be, or in my case, I want to be a parent with that particular person as the father of my children. So it becomes, sort of a biological drive with the right person. You're quite right. It is from that perspective. It has nothing to do with the child.
Yes, and when the child arrives, it's a different story. Then there is another that you can relate to, and of course you have to very quickly you have to understand its needs, its priorities, its sort of demands that places upon the parents. But up to that point, there is just a kind of an idea. Of course, for the mother, it becomes more present through pregnancy, right? And there is more conduct, a kind of some type of preoccupation with the child, hopefully around this time and immediately after the birth. But there is something in a way that the initial desire comes out of one sort of image of what they would like to be in relation to the child as a parent, but probably as part of I want to have a family, I want to have, you know, this with my partner or that. And of course, it's not, it doesn't depend on the actual desire of the child as such, you know, it's not present. So fundamentally, that continues, you know, subsequently when it continues with the children, and they become a symbol, you know, they have to fit into the image of what the parents want and they need, you know, either by, you know, restraining, controlling the child to make it to create a master of their own image, or if they become overindulgent and, you know, they treat the child as, you know, Her Majesty the baby, right? And there is high overstimulation and overindulgence and over spoiling in a way. There is something about that can lead also to some type of narcissistic disturbance later on. So either too much or too little, you know, can affect and can lead to some form of narcissistic disturbance. You know?
So let's talk about that, because that as a baby is formed, when they start showing narcissistic tendencies, how early would you say that happens? And is it always fundamentally observable that will always be the case? Can they be retrained? In my opinion, they can be. But I have seen those narcissistic approaches. Yeah.
Look, I mean, there are different views on that. And of course, if you started, for example, with Freud, he believed that narcissism was the limit of psychoanalytic therapy. You can't, there is no hope. There is no, because he believed that with narcissism, there is no transference. There is no, you know, there is no investment in the person of the therapist. So there is no transference, that type of investment, that attachment to the other. There is no way to work therapeutically with them.
Yeah.
Right. So for him, the narcissist was the limit of psychoanalytic therapy. Defining psychoanalytic therapy, its main tool was transference, dreams and transference, but they are both species of the same. They're both varieties of the same species. They both include fantasy and a way of, you know, imagining what the other should be and attaching to that imagination. However, you know, for a lot of people have developed different ways of approaching narcissism, which moves away from the Freudian enterprise, and they focus more on the way of either through object relations or some more relational intersubjective perspective, where the narcissist is the one who withdraws out of some type of either early impingement or early traumatic sort of intervention, or through some type of overindulgence to that type of narcissistic enclosure, narcissistic retreat. And hopefully there is a way to bring them back into some type of communication with the other through narcissistic therapy, through psychoanalytic therapy, or other forms of therapy, to establish this type of connection. So the people differ. There are people that believe, like Freud, that narcissism is the limit, others that believe that it's difficult but it's not impossible, and others who believe that, you know, with the right amount of time, patience and empathy, you can, especially with certain more sort of thin-skinned type of narcissism, more sensitive, more traumatized, you will be able to find a place for this trauma and this early sort of disturbance, to be able to address it and find a way to compensate for it in a kind of reparative way, which eventually will lead to some movement away from this early narcissistic position. So yes, I mean, there are different approaches and different ways of seeing about it. But I think you know, one of the ways I think about narcissism, and it's very interesting, is when the child having to deal with the disappointment and difficulties with a parent who is either neglectful or overwhelming, can be both. She has to grow really fast, and she has to become very quickly very self-sufficient. So it's as if, you know, she needs to run ahead of herself, like her mom needs to grow, to he or she needs to really grow really fast and become self-sufficient. Is developing a kind of combination of self that is not very well formed, very fragile. A sense of there is a fragility of self because it's not yet, it's a kind of child self which is very fragile and not fully formed, with not enough boundaries and not enough sort of strength to be able to move through in life. But there is a kind of intellectual and other sort of growth that happens really fast in order to be able to survive this type of disappointment, neglect, of overwhelming affection. And then there is a combination of this fragility with a self that becomes quite ideal. I will become this wonderful, famous, I will perform, I will be this wonderful person that everybody will love, and I will attract this attention, together with the image of the ideal parent in order to preserve, to react against the devaluation and the sense of the disappointment that I experience with the parent. So there is a combination of the ideal parent, ideal self, and this fragility of self that exists behind this devalued, fragile self that exists behind, which masks behind this sort of ideal sort of self and parent combination. So the object and the self combine into this ideal formation, which of course never quite manages to sustain itself for long, because every time there is a kind of crisis, this ideality and the reality of the situation come in conflict, and that the fragility of the narcissistic person can come through. And that's what narcissistic people are afraid the most, to appear fragile, vulnerable, in need of the other.
And also it reveals their own shame at those stages. Why? It's such a sad thing, because the shame really isn't theirs. It's just given to them because they feel shame, because they feel they're not enough.
Yes.
And it's not really something they've done. It's not like, oh, I've stolen something or I've cheated on someone. It's my, this is my punishment. It's not, but they carry this shame through with them. So everything that happens around them, once they're in analysis, becomes, if I reveal that, that's being revealed, I feel shame and I can't. They need that support to to overcome those areas and to understand. But I do think you're obviously so right in all the different areas, almost timelines. People have different ages and stages inside themselves. And, this is something I look at. What age are you in this particular area? And it doesn't mean that people haven't grown or haven't tried. They just couldn't.
They couldn't,
because
no.
we need the reflection to be able to grow. We need to know that we're on the right track. We need to know we're doing the right thing and somebody's helping us. But the survival, and that is where I think a number of narcissists come to the fore, because they are great survivors. They know that they've got to survive. But
absolutely, and grandiosity, this level of grandiosity, and not every narcissist, of course, develops this grandiose schema. I mean, this is one way of coping and surviving. But this type of grandiosity is a kind of defense and a survival mechanism against something that they feel is very injurious, traumatizing, quite disappointing, or neglectful. There is some type of early developmental trauma that leads to a kind of reaction, which is survival reaction. I need to make it. And, one of the ways of making it is to occupy this grandiose place of feeling that nothing can touch me. I don't need anyone. I don't.
Yes, well, it's their defense mechanism, isn't it? They have to, because the pain of being rejected, as they see it from the parent and everything around them, they have to protect themselves. So, and they have to feel they're worth protecting themselves.
Yes.
They have to find something within them that they actually feel valuable.
And of course, every time this grandiose, this ideal self with the ideal parent sort of combination is challenged, or they feel, in need of someone, but they cannot quite say it because that reveals the vulnerability. Then, you become exposed to that fragility that fundamentally brings a lot of shame, a lot of shame and a lot of fear. And of course, dependency is feared because the early experience of dependency was that of impingement, of disappointment, of abuse, of being used, as narcissistic extensions of the parents. So they've been traumatized possibly by narcissistic parents, and they repeat that in their own their own life. So, but I think there is something here that there are different variations of that story. Some can be more traumatized and more grandiose, some less. Some they can become quite thick-skinned and nothing can touch them, or appear that nothing touches them. But but then gradually they have to face the realities of life, aging, death, loss, and that for narcissists is already a big test. Losing one's looks, losing one's sort of.
This is Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray.
Absolutely. This is very, very pertinent. Yes, facing the reality of one's sort of physical decline, or even prowess of one's intellect, it becomes quite a narcissistic wound, and then it reveals fragility that needs to be avoided. But I think on some level or another, we all contain this narcissistic part.
Of course.
Yeah.
We have to have that, don't we?
Yeah. We need to have. There is, of course, when we talk about, this is some of this misinformation that takes place in the media these days. You see all of these podcasts and all these people talking about this narcissist in your life that is making you suffer and you need to run away from them. They're like vampires. Right? They become these horrible people that you need to avoid at any cost. And if you are, you need to manipulate in order to manage the situation. Now, I'm not saying that this is completely untrue, but it has become such a cliche in our times that trying to explain relationships by pointing the finger to one of the participants and saying you are a narcissist, I'm a victim of narcissistic abuse, right? And without seeing what is the role of the other person in that sort of that configuration. But apart from that, to point that there are only these narcissists out there and everybody else is exempt from that. It's quite problematic. Because I always found this, in many ways, in what we do in psychoanalysis, and this is the truth of everything that the psychoanalysts have discovered, was that in pathology we see aspects that are included in so-called normality. There are always narcissistic elements in every one of us. How more some people more accentuate in some others, and depending on circumstances in our lives, sometimes we get into our own narcissistic bubbles. For example, I remember when I was after a big loss in my life, I felt quite withdrawn, right? And I felt, I talked about losing my late wife. I felt quite withdrawn. I felt like I didn't care about the world. In my mind, if the world didn't care about, keeping my wife alive, why would I care about the world? And I stopped caring, and in many ways, it was also lucky that during that period, I took a break from practice because, I couldn't care as much. I felt withdrawn. I felt like I needed to withdraw my energy from investments I had, apart from a few good friends and few acquaintances that I could trust. I felt that I couldn't just invest in the world and be interested in the world or, take care of other people anymore. I had to, it became quite narcissistic in trying to take care of myself and withdrawn in myself, and grieve in the way that I could grieve and needed the support of others. And there is nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, I can see that how an injury, how a trauma, how a big loss in your life, how something that can really injure you, make you feel quite upset, can make you go into places where you feel quite lost in a narcissistic bubble, where you do things that can be quite self-destructive as well, without realizing. So you need in a way in that moment the care of others. Because and that's what happens sometimes with, what I call the thin-skinned narcissists who experience loss and trauma and challenges in life. They withdraw into a place that can become, they withdraw their energy from the world. They become quite self-absorbed. They cannot see that other people care, and they stop trusting. And they stop caring for others, of course. And that stops the two-way street that is necessary to keep relationships. And they become quite aloof and isolated. And usually this type of narcissistic sort of, presentation comes into after a crisis, these narcissistic injuries. They come into the room and they talk about, and, hopefully the therapist functions as a way of reconnecting with the world and reconnecting with someone else and trying to say, gently, well, that feels very lonely, very isolating. It feels to me that you haven't quite tried to make that connection. Perhaps you will be surprised if you make, someone ask for help, put that at that position that they feel they need something, because that's the worst thing. I need, oh my God, I need. I need to ask for help. I need to extend beyond myself in order to make it through. I mean, if you manage to do that, you have achieved a big.
But also, isn't it also, I quite like the idea of also saying to somebody, you are needed. You have a value here. This is more than just where you are. You have a value in this world, and only you can do that part of what you do, that you have something else to give to the world, which I think is so powerful, that through your trauma, through your sadness, grief, that people go through and you went through, there is so much more that you are learning here. And what a way to learn. It's so, incredibly full of sorrow. And, we have plays and books and films and, everything is written from those moments. But what comes out of it, the transformation that comes out of those traumatic moments, if somebody can come out of it with the correct support, they are transformed. There's no question.
Yes, there is. And for me, there is something about this type of self-destructiveness that comes out of this narcissistic withdrawal. Although it feels protective and you need it, it can also lead to a place where, in order to deal with the pain of trauma that you experience early on, or even later on in life, like I did, instead of finding a relational form that you'll be able to find a place for this pain and communicate it, instead of actually reaffirm your value through the connections that we have and people reflecting back this value, which is, I would say that there is a healthy form of narcissism, the kind of, I praise you, I value you, you're worth.
Absolutely, you cannot. I totally believe in that. There's no good saying to somebody, just because they have a narcissistic, let's say, wound or a narcissistic bruise that you're conscious of as a therapist or somebody else, it's no good just trying to put them down.
Yes, absolutely, man. That's not work.
What they need is, they need to know what is it about them that has value, because underneath it, there is very little value. But equally, they have to do the work themselves. And they don't step into the therapeutic setting. And I do believe this comes down to the therapist as well. If the therapist can't see that and cannot see that they need to have a little bit of that ego support as well, perhaps first and foremost, before they delve in, then the work's never going to happen, because they feel, oh gosh, they're just going to berate me the way that's happened to me over and over again.
Yes.
Let me ask you something, because a lot in my work, when I deal with couples, it's often men come in after a woman has asked them to, or the relationship has broken, even temporarily. It transpires it's temporarily, but the relationship is broken and the man says, okay, hands up, I've got to come in. I don't know what the hell I'm doing. It's not my thing, but I'm going to come in. Do you think that is part of the psychology of men? Do you think men have been overindulged? Do you think men have been made to be too detached? Or is it this, the Myers-Briggs, I love Myers-Briggs as a sort of just as a definition that people can hold on to, as there are fewer women who are thinking types than there are men. Most men are thinking types, most women or females are feeling types. So you have about 2% of thinking types. So I know that because I'm a thinking type. And
Right.
that's why I get on very well, and I get on very well with women, but and I have a fabulous daughter and I adore her and sister and so on. But I have a very easy sort of connection with men and how they think. But most men don't get therapy. Well, what's this? Until you have a breakthrough.
Yeah.
And that breakthrough convinces them. And I know Jung had this quite a lot, not just with men, but women as well. That breakthrough of, look, there is more to you and more happening here than just what you see in your behavior and what you can see in your relationship. Because often the narcissist won't see what's happening in their relationship, won't understand why the woman is being more emotional. Now, the female of the partner or that partner may be more emotional because she carries the emotion from the other person, or that person chooses a more emotional partner to awaken their own emotions.
Maybe.
There's that. Everybody is so different.
You see, in this sort of dynamic, there is a kind of narcissistic and a codependent person, right? And there is something about someone who is very absorbed, doesn't communicate emotion, or if he does, he only does it in order to be able to get some emotion back as a form of supply, right? So they will say, I love you, not because they really mean it, but because they want the other person to adore them, to make them feel good about themselves, to make them feel wanted and needed in a way that is quite exclusive. And so they will do anything in a way to make sure that they will get that. However, and then the codependent is the person who buys into that and actually feeds this, but at the same time, because of their insecurities, because of their attachment styles, they get into a kind of narcissist, a kind of codependent hamster wheel that they go round and round, moving from the hot rewards that get from a narcissist and then go into a kind of the cold sort of indifference that comes once they got bored of them, and they usually discard them. However, there is something about this whole thing that doesn't sit well. I mean, this is the popular narrative, and this goes into the whole sort of podcast industry that has developed around narcissism, with predominantly women who get bad experiences with men. Talk about narcissists and how to deal with a narcissist, how to avoid narcissistic abuse, how not to be codependent. And of course, they forget that, in the myth of Narcissus, there is Echo, right? And Echo itself can be seen as someone who is, not in it herself quite secure and needs this validation from Narcissus for her love. So because her love is not recognized, she pines away. She loses the desire to be present in her own body, in her own substance. So there is very little self-love there for Echo. There is a lot of, but that in itself, the codependent sort of scenario, is not so different from the narcissistic one, because there is also absence of self-love or self-worth. There is also absence of a sense of validation that comes internally, and not so simply look externally from a person who is narcissistic. There is also absence of a sense of security that can come out of their attachments, and internal security. So when you see this, and a lot of people will say that Echo is living her own narcissistic sort of narcissistic dimension through Narcissus. A lot of people become echoes of the partners because somehow through what Klein will call projective identification, they live off their own narcissism through the narcissism of the partners. So they become the grandiose narcissists who attract attention. They become quite sociable. They get all of this supply, and they live off the crumbs of that sort of glory by being associated with them. So there is the narcissistic person, and there is a person who lives off vicariously their own narcissism by associating with them. And so in that sense, the codependency can be seen as another form of narcissism.
Absolutely, because I remember talking to somebody in business, and he said that he had a number of assistants, and he would find that after a while, very short while, he would have to get rid of various assistants because he found that he was allowed to bully them, that they wouldn't listen, wouldn't take direction unless he bullied them. And so what you're saying is that Echo is as much responsible for her act here as Narcissus was. And this is where we have to, both people have to come into therapy. You can't just have one person or the other. And I think that's the key. What does somebody bring out of you in a relationship? What is it that, is this you and you alone? Are you that person that always, you know, sort of goes crazy about certain things? Are you up and down emotionally? Are you volatile emotionally, regardless of who else there is? Or is it just with that person? So he would eventually get the right person who understood him and knew that he didn't need to bully them. And I get that, because within us all, that's our work. That's within us. We have to work on that.
Well, he had his responsibility not to be a bully, of course, right? And not to exemplify this narcissistic trait.
But it's also, it's how do we cope with being bullied? How do we make sure that we're not bullied anymore?
Yeah.
What do we do in order to stop the bullying from happening as well?
Exactly. I think there is something about, you know, standing up, making sure that you're not taking this, being able to offer resistance to this type of behavior and saying, no, this is not good enough. But there are circumstances when there are vast inequality of power that you don't have, means at your disposal to withstand that. Yeah. So there is a responsibility when there is such an asymmetry. It's like there is a responsibility on the side of power to be more respectful, you know, because sometimes, you know, you feel quite powerless to stand up to people with a lot of power. And then, of course, you have to do things, or you believe you have to do things in order to please them. And that generates this sort of type of dynamic. And of course, you know, there is also an asymmetry in therapeutic relations. You know, there is not the same power on the side of the patients as there is on the side of the therapist. So we need to be very respectful of that power, and we need to be watchful for it. It doesn't mean that our patients don't have power, but they can bully us too, and they can make us suffer in the same way. But I think we have a responsibility as professionals to respect that asymmetry and make sure that we don't use our power in ways that are unethical. So in that respect, it's very important that, you know, this is observed in relationships. But more generally, I think this type of codependency, narcissism, they're all sort of subject positions that we occupy in different, you know, they all exist within us as part of being human. To assign certain group of people as this, the narcissist and the codependent, or the empath, so all these type of labels that, you know, describe something very static. Something that cannot change. That's
the biggest problem.
Yeah.
That people that use these labels exactly in that way, that it is static, and it's not static. I've heard that about Myers-Briggs, they say that, and the real psychological types, which Jung created originally in his psychological club, is that it is movable. You're meant to be able to move and develop other aspects of yourself. But now people, as you say, are saying, oh no, you are a psychopath, you are borderline personality, you are this. And the DSM, which didn't start till I think the 1980s, has really done that almost on purpose. It's now on its fifth iteration that deconstructs and deconstructs and deconstructs. And it's like, whoa, where do you go from here?
Yes.
You know, who are these people?
And you're right, Maria. There is something about you start seeing them as pathologies and not as people, right? And then, of course, this is a very close, and then people describe them as vampires. They describe them as sort of nasty people that they want to exploit you and they get the supply from you. And I'm not saying that people cannot be nasty, cannot be, but this capacity, this sadomasochistic sort of capacity exists in every one of us. We find ourselves in places that we have to hold back in order to behave ethically, because it's very easy it's the road of least resistance, right? It's a road of least resistance to lash out, to use violence, to get what you want by exploiting and manipulating someone, instead of actually, you know, trying to work with them. which is more difficult because it's complex, it involves a lot more effort, and it takes more time.
It does. And I think in our society where those structures are breaking down, religion, ethical, moral, they're all breaking down. So it's now a free-for-all, which it was many years ago, sort of hundreds of years ago, and we've gone back to that moment. But even when you look at people like sort of like the Krays and so on, the East End Krays in London, they had a moral, they observed morality. They would only do to others that were in that gang world. They wouldn't touch women in the same way. They loved their mothers. So you hear stories about this crazy world of serial killers where the family didn't know. So they had this split, this Jekyll and Hyde aspect. But I think what you're addressing here is that we all have this ability. So if society doesn't join us in that moral code and other people don't join us, we have to find it within ourselves. So, like Odysseus, he had to be strapped onto the mast so that he didn't wander off with the sirens. And we need that. And if you don't have that, you can wander off. And I think that's the reality of our world at the moment. People are wandering off in all sorts of directions with different labels. And it's actually quite painful. And they're like darts, or they're like arrows or swords into other people.
I have to say that, like anything else in our society today, things in relationships as well have become very polarized by calling names. You are like this, you're like that, you're a narcissist, you are codependent, you're a vampire, you are a supply whore. I mean, they use all of these names, in order to blame someone. And the whole thing about therapy is actually to understand that there is an environment that can be conducive to one's, but it's actually realizing of how much of that is also your contribution and your responsibility. And actually to think about how exactly you find yourself in these situations. Of course, you need to understand the reality of abuse, and there is real abuse out there. We need to acknowledge it. And we need to take social measures as well as individual to protect ourselves. I'm not denying that for a minute, of course. And I think it's one of the benefits of our time that highlighted abuse more than any other time. However, we've gone to the place now that everybody occupies another narcissistic position of that of the victim.
Yes.
And everybody becomes a victim. And through the position of the victim, they're allowed then to become themselves narcissistic abusers.
Yeah, totally.
And this is where that can be another narcissistic bubble, where you feel that you're only victim and nothing else. First of all, it's not good for you to feel that you're only victim, that you have no other power. But second is almost like a kind of, for a lot of people, and I know from a lot of my patients, sometimes they need to be helped to get out of this, in order to understand that because they feel like victims, they entitle themselves, or they allow themselves, or they permit themselves to do things that they say other people do to them, and they don't see it because they. So I think the moment someone takes responsibility, it's very important to have this moment of self-reflection, this introspection, this sense of, and that's where the depth starts to get, and that's where perhaps it's very important to work differently with different types of narcissistic injury. For the ones who are very sensitive and they're very fragile and they feel that there is not enough of grandiosity to help them against the world, what is important is to get them out of this victim mentality in order to enable them to realize that how, through this covert type of narcissism, they also attract some type of, they enact some type of passive aggressivity or abuse to their environment.
Because equally, I've known relationships where the so-called, there's an abuser and the victim, in a way, it almost gives fire to the narcissist. The narcissist has to, because they goad and goad and goad until the narcissist blows up, and they're both at fault because there's no space between. It's the joy of space, understanding, just step back get away from the dance, the crazy dance, the angry dance, the dance of madness that we can all get into. But sometimes it's so incendiary that the person who has least control can affect the victim. And so it goes on in round and round. But coming back to something in society, I believe self-help books haven't helped, because self-help books give people the false belief that they can actually see themselves objectively. And I think they can't. They can see certain elements of themselves. Yes, I can do this, so, that there are various tools of behavior. And yes, that makes me stop and think, but how do you know you're going down the right path? Until you have somebody outside that you trust, that you believe in, that has done the work, who is objective enough and is wise enough, we're talking about wisdom here, to actually guide you into the space that you need to go into. And I think often people say, well, I've read this book and I've read this book, and oh my goodness, now I'm on this, my 100th self-help book, but they're still finding the old patterns come up. And they have gone to have ayahuasca, psilocybin, they've gone to see their spiritual awakening, and I know that there is, the wonderment out there, but they still have to come down to life, and they still can't find their way because they have nobody that they trust to guide them.
Yes, I think you're absolutely spot on there. And that points back to the idea that of self-sufficiency, and I can do it all on my own. Yeah. And I'm the only one who's accountable, which of course denies the reality of dependency and the need for others actually in our lives to both function as guides, but actually sometimes to challenge us. It's very easy, and that's the road of least resistance. It's very easy to follow a path, which is, a narcissistic path where you ignore the consequences, thinking that your actions have to others, thinking that you're doing nothing wrong. I've seen it again and again and again and again, and myself as well. I was thinking I was doing nothing wrong. I felt like, oh, look what they're doing to me, and I need to react in a certain way. And by doing this, I enact some kind of revenge, and I'll take my own back because they deprived me of this. And when confronted in therapy with my own actions and the consequences of that, I see that I'm not so different from the person I'm accusing, right? And in that moment, I'm able to hold back and think, oh, right, I can be like that too. I haven't realized. And of course, that takes someone with a certain level of self-reflection and self-worth to be able to take this not as a criticism, not as an attack from the therapist, but as something that is valuable in order to become an ethical subject, to consider yourself in relation to others. And that is the difficulty sometimes with people who are more traumatized and therefore more withdrawn and more narcissistic than others. But a challenge like that by the therapist can be seen as an attack. So you have to be very careful. You have to work in order to build the self to function as a scaffolding, to build the self to a certain level of security and to maintain a level of trust. So when you perform challenges like this, for not to be seen as attacking. Because if you do it very early, the therapist can collapse. So we're talking about very sensitive work that can last for years. And this is why, the work with narcissistic disorders is very difficult. Now, but also it's very important for the therapist to understand their own narcissism and their own investment and how the whole industry has developed in order to blame certain people, in order to make the therapist look good in terms of their own inability to deal with it.
That's only if you mix with other therapists. I know, I've heard that amongst therapists, I must say. I don't have that many therapist friends, so I'm pleased I'm not in that milieu. But I hear that, and I think what you said is so powerful, that we as therapists must hold ourselves up and understand what that person needs. And I think, so during that moment, and it's normally 50 minutes, it's not long, but it's like opening another chapter of a book. You have to immerse yourself, don't you? In that person, totally, really understand what do they need today as well. But I love dream work because of that. Dream work actually gives you an idea of what they're working through, but also that ability to reflect for them and you to reflect. But coming back to your point about your own projections. And Jung always said this, and this is fairly commonly known, but not many people recognize it, is if somebody irritates you, look at what that is that they are irritated. What is it about them that irritates you, and which part of you is that highlighting? It may not be all of you, but it may be a part of you. And if so, which part? And how do you then address that irritation so it's an awareness rather than an irritation? Look, you're being shown something. And I think in life, we're often shown parts of ourselves or a way to go. I've often had messengers that, you know, when I did my first course where we met, the MA, and you weren't directly my professor, but it was great to have you there. And you did some other classes, and I had Dr. Tessa Adams, who was extraordinary, as you know, and Beverly. But I was told about that course through a friend of mine who was a healer, and she wanted a healing plus psychotherapeutic course. But when she told me, she said, "Will you do it with me?" And I said, "Of course, I've been looking for something like this." It was primarily Jungian. But she dropped out because she wanted more healing and she didn't want the theory. But perfect for me. So you've got to get to know yourself. Where are the signs for you? We are so different. And that's our spiritual nature. And that's where mirroring comes in. You know, when somebody dies, they used to cover the mirror around people, so you don't get your self reflection or the reflection of the soul, which we should include at some point, but we can't today because it's so big, that element of the soul and the spirit. But we are mirrors of each other to some extent. And what is actually going on for me in my life that this is bringing up for me, and what is happening to me. But if you're too self-reflective, you don't move on. You've got to take a break at times and go, I've had enough of self-reflection. Let me move on with my life and see what I've learned. And I've got to move up that sort of my own ladder of existence. I
think there is time for thinking and time for action. It's matter of timing, as everything in life.
Yeah.
And I think for me, I have to, before I point the finger to others and say, you know, this is that, or I always have to take a hard look at myself first, in order to find ways of holding myself accountable, in order to be able then to help others. And I think that's part of my relational tradition as well in therapy, that I see narcissism or any pathology developing out of not understanding pain. The pain that starts in a relationship, and of course can always be explicated and understood and withstood within a relationship. I mean, narcissism doesn't develop in a vacuum. Freud wants us to believe that it's the first stage, and then, but there's something about withdrawal, even for Freud, withdrawal from relationship to an object, to withdrawal to a narcissistic state, as a way of avoiding relationships with, you know, that the world becomes overwhelming or becomes something that is too painful, and you withdraw into this narcissistic state. For me, it's it's relationships that don't provide this type of either become abusive and neglectful very early on, and you are in a state of helplessness, and you have no other way of managing and surviving the situation but developing a kind of grandiose self in order to cope with the lack of attunement, the lack of understanding, the lack of compassionate attachment. And that in itself becomes a defense against this absence, this fundamental absence and neglect. And also in many ways is a reaction against this early sort of, so it happens in a relationship and can only sort of be rectified in a relationship again, where the pain finds the pain of that early sort of neglect, abandonment, abuse, the sense of impingements that force someone to develop a sense of grandiosity with a very fragile self and an ideal parent situation that he wants to maintain at any cost. You're trying to bring forth, to reenact, to play, and of course your own traumas, your own grandiosity as a therapist, thinking that you are the healer, thinking that you can make a difference, thinking that you are the one who's good therapist. You've been challenged, you've been brought to within that relationship, your own traumas will come forth and your own sort of woundedness will appear. And you have to deal with your own. You have to ask for help. You have to ask for support. That's why supervision, that's why peer supervision, that's why talking about this, having colleagues that you can trust is very important. So you don't feel alone in this. And a lot of therapists have very much believe that they can handle everything, they can deal with everything. And of course, they find clients that they challenge them to the extent that they cannot cope anymore.
Yeah.
And because it's very challenging work.
Mm-hmm. But
so also, there will be enactments that you will feel wounded because, of course, the narcissist, in order to maintain, the moment you point to the vulnerability, in order to maintain their own sense of grandiosity, they will try to devalue you as a therapist. Of course, if you come from your own woundedness that you've been devalued or you felt humiliated or feel embarrassed and ashamed about your own sort of history, that will play out. And you need to be careful about how this is enacted and how you can become vengeful. Right?
You will find that client relationship will actually, it's that timeline. It's almost every one of those problems you've had have been there throughout your life.
Yes.
And that client will then reflect that again and again and again. And it's almost like, right, now you have to deal with that. I had bullying quite a lot in my life. And I finally, I think, dealt with how to handle bullying effectively only after I'd done my PhD, in a big way. And it wasn't, I'm not saying boo-hoo. It was just one of those things that kept recurring in a certain way. So you find that you've got a pattern, everybody's got a pattern. But how do you finally manage it in a way that you can overcome that bullying? Because I love the term zwang. That's what Freud called, isn't it a great term? Zwang, the compulsion to repeat.
Yes.
And we have that zwang within us all. We do want to repeat things, but we repeat it in order to find power over it. Once we find power over it, it dissolves. And, those bullying moments that happened to me, I think finally I understood how I could effectively deal with that moment of what I perceived as bullying, which in fact it was bullying, but it was bullying in quite an interesting way. But it was nevertheless, it's how you feel, how you overcome it, and how you find your own power through it. It's so fascinating, isn't it? Because we are also individual, but it's great to talk like this, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It is great. And for me, I have to say that especially during periods in my life that I have crisis, and I might have ended up in relationships that were quite destructive because I wanted to enact with someone else, probably with their own narcissistic goodness, some type of mutual self-destruction.
Absolutely.
So I use the other as an instrument for my own punishment and vice versa.
Yes.
And in that sense, when I was able to survive and leave that relationship and manage, it's also become quite instructive in terms of how people can quite easily go into a bubble, whether it is a narcissistic bubble or a relationship bubble, where they get into these patterns of, sadomasochistic patterns that inflict pain without even realizing it, because fundamentally they cannot stand the pain inside them.
Yeah, and
it's easier to inflict it on another and to see it on another than to see it in oneself.
Yeah, of course.
But it gets replayed and played again and again and again until, of course, it becomes unbearable and sometimes can become very, very problematic. You need to withdraw. You need to establish no contact, to manage your own anxieties, to find a way through, and eventually to gather, to be self-reflective enough to be able to gather a sense of oneself as someone who, okay, I can stand this pain, I can manage this loss, I can have the support that I need, and I'm able actually to be worth enough to have decent relationships. And I don't need to go to relationships that cause mutual harm. But because I don't believe that someone who is, who's excessively narcissistic, although they can be, without realizing it, they can be quite dangerous.
Of course.
Without realizing it. They can be very
It comes back to your main point.
But then the other person that thinks this codependent can actually inflict a lot of pain.
And this is the point, that we all have that ability in us. And, you know, I went to Auschwitz. My uncle was murdered in Auschwitz. I use the term murdered on purpose. It was, you know, a genocide. We're not Jewish, my family, but he was murdered nevertheless. And as I'm walking down, I'm thinking, anybody, lots of people were sort of swept up in that madness. And we can't imagine what we would have been like in that moment, what we would have done. Everybody has a different thing. We hope that we're not going to be that extreme, but within us all, we have that madness.
Yes, yes, we do.
And we have to contain that.
That's exactly what psychodynamic work teaches us, that we contain these moments, these psychotic moments, this madness, this sense of disintegration, this pain that becomes unbearable and is easy to see inflicted on the other because we cannot bear it. And in many ways, it's almost like beating someone up because you've been beaten. It's identifying with the aggressor, identifying with the power, that's the false sense of power that gives you a false sense of mastery in terms of your own internal forms. And if you don't have mastery of your own internal forms, fundamentally, you subscribe to a false type of mastery. Because narcissism, if anything, is a false type of mastery. It's a grandiosity, which is a hot air balloon.
And that's what people are looking for, aren't they? They want to be told instead of understanding what they're told.
Yeah, there is no substance, there is no real mastery of one's internal forms, of one's, you know, there is often this idea that to be a master of something is always it comes out of the master-slave dialectic, or the kind of sadomasochistic encounters between the master and the submissive and all of this stuff. But for me, there is a real mastery of one's own sort of worth and feeling, and that leads to a sense of humility, leads to a sense of not being boastful, and not to grandiosity, but quite the opposite, of being present in your life and being present in the life of others that need you. That's a real mastery. And that comes with a sense of a mastery of the idea that as humans we will fail, we will not always be successful, we won't be perfect, that we will fail ourselves and each other, that somehow we are ordinary and we don't need to be extraordinary, and that is enough. That is enough to get us through. And we need, you know, we only have each other in a way at the end of this. You know, we don't have very much to go about. We have ourselves and each other. And if we don't do that, if we don't rely on others and, you know, and ourselves to get through difficult times, what we rely on is this false sense of mastery, that we don't need anyone. We don't rely on anyone. We can control everything. We can dominate everyone. And then we don't have relationships. And fundamentally, it's a very lonely place. So, you know, however much power you have, at the end of the day, you know, you get it's intoxicant. It gives you a high, but it doesn't leave you fulfilled. That's why you need more. That's why you need satisfied. That's why it's always not enough. That's why you need more power. You need more money. You need more of this, more of that. It's never enough, because there is a fundamental emptiness that cannot be filled.
Well, we could go on, but I think our time's up. But we will be coming back. Anastasios Gaitanidis, thank you. And again, you know, what can I say? It's just a joy to talk to you. And we've opened up the subject of the real myth of Narcissus, but also it's a story of our time, isn't it? Again, you know, all of these, it's almost like there's an explosion in people trying to understand the psychology and trying to find their place. And I hope that anybody listening finds value from this and a little bit of understanding that we are complicated. We can fail, but it doesn't mean we fall apart. And that's right. I just hope that people understand that there is a way through whatever they're going through.
Yes, and you know, just because you fail, it doesn't mean that you are a failure.
Exactly. That's very true. Let's remember that.
Yeah.
Until the next time. Thanks, Anastasios. Take care.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you very much. Thank you.